Today is a special Fireside chat. I'm talking with Steve Jones, the Chief Executive Officer of Equity Health Solutions, and also to Kim Whiteley, the General Manager of Remote Area Health Corps, two of our First Nations colleagues in the Aspen Medical Group. We're going to be talking about Sorry Day, Reconciliation Week, and we're also going to touch on closing the gap and the voice to Parliament. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this Fireside chat has taken place today, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging of all Australia's First Nations people. Well, first of all, thanks for coming in this morning to have a chat, Steve and Kim. Now, I started off there, as I normally do, with an acknowledgement of country, Kim. That's been done for quite some time. Do you want to talk a little bit about the acknowledgement of country and what it means and why it's done?
Yeah, so thanks. The acknowledgement to country, for me, means and symbolises a relationship with my identity from where I'm from, rules and practice and protocol that allowed me to enter other people's country for an acknowledgement, and for a welcome, relaying protocol and ways of doing for others who come to my country. And in that way, we sustain our relationship with the land, we feast from the land, and we give back to the land. And that's what it means for me. It signals where I'm from and my relationship to the country and my identity.
Can you share that, Steve?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's very, very important. The other thing that I like to look at from both a welcome to country and an acknowledgement of country is that spiritual connection. Right, because we are on country, and country isn't just the land that we are; it's that whole issue of the environment, that spiritual connection, and it's very, very important, and it sets the scene, right, for that engagement with each other.
Can I just, and a little bit contentious, get going early? Do you get a sense as First Nations people that a little bit like I would have likened it in Mass when I was in Mass with my mother in Ireland, and people say prayers and they just sometimes are not thinking about the words, and it's rattled off almost like some kind of predetermined, you're not thinking about the words. Would you like to see acknowledgement of country slightly changed around, moved around from place to place, that people aren't sounding like it's pre-recorded? Do you know what I mean? Do you get that feel sometimes?
Yeah, I think that it's important for people to know why we're doing a welcome or acknowledgement, but it really doesn't matter how it sounds as long as you're feeling it. You know, if you were meeting somebody important, if you were acknowledging somebody important, you would do that with feeling, you would do that with sometimes a firm handshake, looking in the eye, and you'd be conveying your best regards. The same, I think it's just the same when we're providing an acknowledgement. Yeah.
Steve?
I tend to agree. I think if you look back on a number of acknowledgements that I've given previously, yes, you have your standard, right? But then I'll also acknowledge probably the theme, right, or the people, or the environment that we're actually addressing in that particular area, because I think that's important as well. It's also the question of, should we be doing acknowledgements to country for every meeting and so forth? No, I think it can be overdone, absolutely overdone. And it is important, though, where particularly with other Aboriginal people that are there, that we do that. And I like the way that some of the departments actually work, where they give it in language, but it is opening up, and I think Kim might have mentioned it before, it's all about engagement, right, and that real heartfelt engagement. So let's put it into context as well, and that's just the way I like to see it.
Good, okay. We're here today because it's the start of an important week and a bit. It's Sorry Day today. We'll talk about Reconciliation Week in a little bit, but Sorry Day is marked today. It's May 26th. Steve, Sorry Day, can you just take people, for those who aren't 100% sure, a lot of stuff is written about Sorry Day, and there's references to Kevin Rudd and the apology, and sometimes, again, it gets a little bit, I suppose, lost, and people go on autopilot. Can we just get a little understanding about what Sorry Day is about?
Yeah, and well, on this day in 1997, the report on the stolen generation was presented to government, and then 12 months later was the first Sorry Day. Right, and it was the apology was wonderful from the then Prime Minister, but it is saying sorry basically for that hurt and that occurred, and we see it now also with the ongoing trauma that people have found within their families. If I can just put you into context with my family, for example, many of my uncles and aunts had difficulty identifying as being Indigenous, right, on the basis that their mother, my grandmother, who was a full-blood Yorta Yorta woman, she said to them, whatever happens, deny that you are Aboriginal, run away because they'll take you away, right? And then about in the early 80s, I found out one of my cousins was from the stolen generation. She's a wonderful, wonderful woman, lives in Sydney, not far from me, and she didn't realise that she was Aboriginal and had been taken at birth as a part of the stolen generation, right? And it took her 40 years to find her way back into the family. She was the daughter of my eldest aunt. And it was just so wonderful, but the impact on her was just incredible. And you'll find that there is a lot of reference to the trauma that families are still undergoing from that time. It reverberates down. So I think people just need to take a bit of time to reflect on those particular issues. But I think that's just enough. I could go on for a little while on that, but it is very, very important to recognise that, and hence Sorry Day.
Yeah. Why had children had to be taken away?
Sure. I think before we skip to why children were taken away, we have to consider, and Sorry Day for me considers a whole lot of policies intended for our own good, but policies that have impacted us. As Steve rightly mentioned, Sorry Day highlights the intergenerational trauma on the stolen generations. But I go back further, and let's talk about policies related to dispossession and how lands were taken away for Aboriginal people. Let's then talk about a generation on from that, and that's my great-grandfather. And so he had policies that wanted to segregate him from communities, exemption certificates and so on. Then another generation on is my mum. I beg your pardon, it's my nan. So she was in an era where after assimilation, segregation and protection, she was taken away from her families, removed and worked as a maid. Another generation on is my mum, who spent life on the run because her skin colour was just a little bit too white. So those policies, assimilation, protection, removal, exemptions, all intended for our own good as people, have intergenerational impacts, as does the policy that did remove and separated families, tore them from their lands, separated them from their families, and has left the legacy of intergenerational impacts that we see today. Higher rates of incarceration, health problems, the data and statistics. We don't have to rehearse what it is. We know the disparity exists. And so for me, when I look at why we're sorry, I know individuals were not responsible, but this is the impact of policies where there has been no Indigenous voice within those decisions that impact us. You know the old saying, nothing about us without us? Well, they're those policies. They're those things that impact us. The stolen generations have left horrific intergenerational trauma that we still see today. And so that's to me what the guts of Sorry Day is. That's what the experiences that our people before us have endured. And so it's a look at that holistic picture of the absence of a voice in policies that have impacted us over time and through time.
Okay. And just thank you for that. We will cover the voice in a bit of detail later on. Obviously, it's a burning issue across the country. So, but in terms of, because I still find it extraordinary when I look at my own experiences, things that you think happened hundreds of years ago only happened 30, 40 years ago. Well, when I was a teenager, I didn't realise in Ireland, unmarried mothers were put into what was called laundries and their children taken from them. And that was up until the 1990s. I had gone through university, I was in my first job, and these things happened only 30 years ago. With the stolen generations, can I just understand why did somebody think it was a good idea to take Indigenous children away from their families? What was the basis for that?
Oh, look, it's a very divisive issue. A lot of people thought it was the right thing to do, and there is another. These are white people.
Yeah.
Right? The other issue was that there was the intent to, if you want, breed out the black side within the family, because you could be a better person because you were white. I think they called the cards that were issued, the exclusion cards, or
the exemption certificates. That's what I talked about with my great-grandfather.
These were ridiculous into the 60s, and it hit home to me when I went back to country and I went into the museum, and there was the card. I'd show you the card in there. And it was quite specific in there that what the rules were, right? You couldn't associate with other Aboriginal people. You couldn't talk language, right? The cutting comment down the bottom was, and if you adhere to these, you too could be treated like a white man, right? And this was a card into the early 60s. Right, and just happens this is one of my mob down in Echuca, and I sort of looked at it and I thought, this is just amazing. And I actually had a poster on my wall and said, that's the past. And next to that I had, fortunately things had changed now, it was one of my young cousins dressed up in traditional possum skin and so forth, and doing dance and playing the didgeridoo, and that was the future. And it was quite amazing. Yeah,
it's interesting because you mentioned something that I know you speak your own language because I've heard you. Yeah. Kim, are you fluent?
I'm not fluent. No. I have done a couple of language courses in Wiradjuri.
Yeah.
I can sing more than I can speak.
We might leave that one for another day. It's interesting because in Ireland we have a Irish people, some people call it Gaelic, we call it Irish. It's a bit like the way French people speak French, we speak Irish. But we have a phrase that, I won't say it in Irish, but how it translates is that a country without a tongue is a country without a soul. So language is a huge defining piece of what your culture is from an Irish perspective. Is that we speak English because that was the empire's language, so to speak. But to have your own language is the one thing that will always separate you from people who look the same or act the same, is that you have that language. It was just an interesting one because I have heard you
very limited
speaking. Anyway, still sounds beautiful.
Let me just mention something in relation to those exemption certificates. So along with that, you had to agree that you would not use your language and that you would actually denounce your culture. And so you mentioned in the Irish context, the soul doesn't exist, and to have that soul taken away from you, and you live by that, is really difficult for those both who had an exemption certificate and for those who resisted that policy as well.
Yeah, no, it's as I said, that language piece, I speak fluent Irish, and I would be pretty unusual in that sense. But the point is, it's something no matter where I am in the world. I'm an Australian citizen. My children sound like they're from neighbours and home and away. But the one thing I hang on to is the fact that I can speak the Irish
It's an
language.
important point because under the Closing the Gap, there's 17 socio-economic outcomes, and I think it's number 16 or 17 talks about the importance of language and regenerating that. Because as a minimum, remembering each nation has its own language. There is clearly a lot of talking between, but there are at least 35 languages that are now that have died, and they're trying to do the research to regenerate those languages. So an important part of closing the gap.
Yeah, beautiful. So Sorry Day is today. Leads us into Reconciliation Week. I have a couple of questions about reconciliation, but we'll get to that. What does Reconciliation Week mean for you specifically, Kim?
So again, it means a look at those policies that have impacted us, but more so, it means a celebration of how we have come through that. First Nations people have existed and endured those policies, how we can celebrate our culture now and into the future and reclaim what we were perhaps unable to use before, our culture and parts of it that were suppressed. We as a people being oppressed are able to celebrate achievements of others and achievements of our culture. And so that's why we need a week of celebration, to look at our past but our future as a united one, to celebrate going forward the things that we have achieved and the unity of a one solid Australia.
Okay. Steve, you? How's it?
Look, I think it's all encapsulated in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which talks about voice, treaty and truth. But more importantly, it's the invitation to all Australians to go on this journey. And that journey is reconciliation. We are all Australians. Right? Black, white, yellow, doesn't really matter. Right? We are moving together. It's the opportunity to recognise our history. Now, some of our history together is not being good. But I think, as Noel Pearson has said, Australia goes back for 65,000 years. 234 years ago, when the Brits first arrived, that changed or enhanced the culture. Right, we can remember that there is that enhancement, and then within 100 years later, with that multicultural arrival of people from Europe and so forth. So it's reconciliating that whole thing, but recognising Australia, because of this multicultural aspects, is, I would argue, one of the greatest countries in the world in this particular area. So reconciliation is about that to me, overcoming those shortfalls that have occurred historically, but together, right? And that's why the Uluru Statement says, "Come with us on this journey. We're heading off now. Come with us." And that's all I can plead with everyone, to have that single focus.
Can I ask, reconciliation? I was thinking about this morning. And again, I've come from a country where reconciliation has been important as part of things like the Good Friday Agreement and the end of violence. You have South Africa that had a Truth and Reconciliation Forum for quite some time. Do you think reconciliation sounds like a process, which it is? Is there an end goal? Is there reconciled? Do we ever become reconciled? Is that the end goal for everything? That there is a point in time where things are reconciled? And where is that? Is it another generation away? Is it a bit contentious question? I get it. And it might be too big for now, but it's just a point that reconciliation, by its very definition, is happening, and hopefully it comes to a point where things are reconciled. That can happen, and the voice is part of that.
Again, I'd just like to put forward that reconciliation, I'm certain, is not something we as First Nation people said, let's have reconciliations. We've asked for things, we've asked to be recognised, and we were given reconciliation. So it's something, I think, as the past policies have been bestowed upon us. I think it's not up to us to decide whether there's an end point or not, because for us, our culture is continuing. It has continued and it will endure. And so reconciliation for me and perhaps many others is the notion of that journey and the continuation of it. And so in that context, I don't think that there is an end to something or for the term as a process, beginning and end. I look at it as culture, ever evolving and continuing.
Thank you. No, that's because I just sat there thinking to myself, that was a typical Aspen medical question, because we're project managers, we have a start and we have an end. Now, can I ask, going back to work momentarily, you're both senior members of our team, both in interesting parts of the business because you deal with First Nations health. How does all this impact your day-to-day job and how you think about what you're doing? Steve, you first.
Okay, I think it's the whole issue is important, and I think it's encapsulated in our reconciliation action plan, which is not something which was just written out. It was carefully considered by a wide number of people across the Aspen team, and I think arguably, and from my point of view, it's one of the best reconciliation action plans that's been determined, right, or designed, and it is that ongoing journey at the moment. Within ours, we've actually focused a lot on closing the gap and the socioeconomic outcomes in there that can really have some input. At times, I don't think it is fully recognised across the company just what we've done. And Kim and I have often spoken about how we see that we're a part of the Aspen team, and there is a hell of a lot more that we can do, right? But it's important that people go back and have a look at the reconciliation action plan. It shows clearly, what our path is, where our commitment is, and how we're going to get there. And and as a part of the team, the more there is that understanding of that, then involve us in the conversations. Don't think in stovepipes because I'm here or there. We are all part of that team. And I really would urge that people start looking at that from that point of view. So what is the First Nations aspects of a project? Bring us in. Have a yard about it, because we can only deliver better results by having that approach.
Okay. And Kim, from your perspective, obviously, RAC has placed, I think at this stage, almost or nearly, or just about 8,000 people over the last nearly, I think, 12, 13 years. So obviously the programme you manage has a big impact in the Northern Territory and the communities up there. How does everything we're talking about today, reconciliation, how does that all play into what you do from a RAC perspective?
Yeah, so I've only been there now just a little over 12 months. And yeah, you're very right. We've placed lots of health professionals deployed into remote communities within the Territory. But consider the outcomes of our people and communities in nationwide. Have our health outcomes improved? Some may say yes, but the data tells us no. And when we look and speak to communities, we see still disparity and in some cases lots of despair. So under my leadership with RAC, what has happened most recently is, we'll continue to deploy people, but it's an intentional alignment now to closing the gap reform, to really working in partnerships and lifting and strengthening Aboriginal community control. So what we're doing now is an intentional solution for health professionals being deployed. Do you want a nurse? Yeah, we'll give you a nurse. That's the work of an agency. We're a program, and Aspen Medical has allowed us autonomy to work as a program. And so what that means, we're in desperate need of a nurse. What's going on in the community? What are your needs? Oh gosh, you're behind in child health immunisations. Should we deploy a team? Still within the requirements of what we do and the boundaries of our agreements with the Commonwealth, but more in partnership for a solution with what's going on in the ground. And by the way, we've just finished over the last 3 weeks a project in partnership with Me Watch up at Nullumboy for delivery of a project on Elcho Island, where we sent in a team that aimed to do 500 plus child health vaccinations. That team ended up being a number of nurses, a number of doctors working in partnership with the Aboriginal Community Control Health Clinic, and there were over 1,000 childhood immunisations over that period of time.
So you're talking about a more cookie, the inverse to cookie cutter.
Yeah.
So the over the last number of years, we've had, you need nurses, you need doctors, you need audiologists. What you're saying is taking a more tailored approach from a community by community basis. What's needed within this community, rather than let's just put another nurse in because, well, box ticked. What we're actually talking about is getting in with the community and understanding what the issues are in this community and pulling together a program. Is that it?
That's dead right. And so so that's about, the policies, programs, initiatives, strategies that impact us as Indigenous people and us having a voice in the delivery of services for them. So it's really connecting. That is what is aligning to closing the gap reform. This is not just, and I'd argue with Steve to some degree, it's not Aspen Medical just having a reconciliation action plan. It's Aspen Medical having a subsidiary with Indigenous governance, with Indigenous leadership, who works in Indigenous specific ways to achieve outcomes for people and communities, partnering with communities and clinics in remote areas to lift outcomes for health. Yep, we're deploying, that's tick, what we're supposed to do. But we're doing it really more meaningfully and purposely. We're reaching and considering the voices of the people that we're whose services we're providing to. It's what I've said about the policies that impact us. It's allowing rightfully allowing the voice of how the services are delivered to people.
This is an important area that is encapsulated in our RAP and so forth, because what we're looking at, we've identified that we're not only doing health, right, which is outcome number 1, but child health, which is outcome number 2, outcome number 14, which is the cross-cutting outcome, which talks about aged care. Right? It talks about alcohol and drugs. Right, so there's a whole range of the 17 socioeconomic outcomes that we can attack, and this is exactly what Kim is talking about in terms of the outcome is much better when you start talking about that combined approach, as opposed to we can put in nurses here and so forth. It's exactly to achieve that outcome, better health and so forth.
Steve, I've never heard anybody able to quote particular clauses from closing the gap. So it's really important. And you've mentioned 17 socioeconomic.
Yes.
It's an open-ended question. What are your thoughts around closing the gap? And Kim, get ready, it's coming to you. What's your thoughts around closing the gap overall?
Look, closing the gap is of such fundamental importance. Right. Importantly, with this one, though, the national agreement that was signed in July of 2020 is the first time that Aboriginal people, with the invitation to the Coalition of the Peaks, to contribute to it. Prior to that, it was dictated by the government without any consultation with Aboriginal people. Right. Yeah. The national agreement signed in July of 2020 was that commitment by federal, state, local governments and the Coalition of Peaks, right, representing Aboriginal people. So that's how it's come out now, right? So there are the 17 socioeconomic outcomes, and progress has been slow. We're not kicking goals in all areas, but it is a positive movement forward. People or corporations and organisations don't fully comprehend, though, just how they can have an impact on not only 1 and 2 and 3, but how they can, by changing the way they operate, also impact on other areas, right? So that if you have a good, healthy workforce, for example, that increases the opportunities for employment. And economic development is fundamental to closing the gap. So it's a matter of looking at all of those particular areas. So it's not, people think, okay, we're closing the gap. Well, hang on for a second. As we have done in our RAP and that, we've identified those specific areas with the foundation, with RARC, with Equity Health and that, of how we can attack those particular areas. And I think that's a big difference, right? So that we have a focus on the 17. Within those 17, I think we've got 6 that are specifically identified as a result of our capabilities, our broader Aspen medical capabilities.
Kim, closing the gap?
Closing the gap is a guide for all of us and a standard that we need to look at in the ways we deliver services for our First Nation people. I would be one always to holler Aboriginal community control, but we're 3-point-something% of the population. The other 97% is essential to help us close that disparity that exists. And that's what I say about Aspen Medical. It is a global entity that has a subsidiary that is working specifically black to do the business that needs to be done. Being resourced by the expertise within a global entity, why wouldn't we want to suck that goodness out? And it is reciprocal because it demonstrates capability within the larger company, but it is really not just having that wrap, it is really doing the work and supporting the work and resourcing the work that needs to be done. This is the way our communities want services delivered to them, lifting Aboriginal community control, working in partnership are just 2 areas that we are concentrating on within our program. But there's economic drivers in there as well, which are really important because we use local and employ local people for our orientations. It's bringing in and thinking broadly without the blinkers, delivering the work that we do. So closing the gap, yes, it's important. It's a guide for us all to follow. The disparity can't continue the way it is. You know, I'll be gone before I get to use my super, you know. Life chances for us are so much shorter. It is 2023 and we've got to change that.
Okay. Thank you so much. Last question. Contentious? No, not contentious at all. Let's talk about the voice. We've mentioned it periodically. You've mentioned the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Unless I'm hugely mistaken, and we'll have to edit this bit out if I'm wrong, our own chair of Remote Area Health Corps, Pat Anderson, had a role to play in that. Steve, I know you're both passionate about it, and I know we haven't had a chance yet really to talk to our team at Aspen Medical about your thoughts on this. This is a great opportunity. I think we may as well take it. It's an open-ended question again. We'll finish on this. The voice. What does it mean? What needs to happen? Go for it.
Look, I'm passionate about the voice. There's no doubt about that. That's a personal issue. And I know we as a company are encouraging everyone to have an understanding. Whether you're going to vote yes or no, it's to make that informed choice. Now, why do I support it so strongly? Well, first of all, recognition in the Constitution. I think 90% Australians have actually agree with that. Then we're getting tight around the edges over what the voice is actually there. There is a lot of people haven't fully understood. There's been statements made in the media, which in my opinion are ignorant statements. They don't address this whole issue of what closing the gap is all about, right? I mentioned the Coalition of Peaks before, and this is an example of where if the voice had been there and had been involved in these particular processes, it could, in a much strengthened position, be able to comment and advise not only the Parliament but also the government executive as well. But no, we went out, we had to form the Coalition of Peaks, right, to provide that input into the government. So the voice will be is recognition, right, and will in turn lead to quality in terms of the inputs on how policies will affect First Nations peoples.
So the voice for me, it is about, again, the recognition of the absence of voice in policy and strategy that has impacted us previously, in the past and going forward. We have Liberal people within Parliament representing Liberal voice, stances, goals, Labor, Greens, whatever. We don't have anyone specifically representing the voice of First Nation people. So the voice for me is that we've got lots of good work being done, but what level does that go to? Where does that stop? The voice within Parliament will allow expertise at a very high level, consultation there, advice there. Whether it's taken up, we don't know. We don't know the answers to that, but it'll get whatever we need on the table to the level that it needs to be taken. What have we got now? A great work that's being done. How far does those voices extend to? How far does that policy advice extend to? With the voice, we know where it'll be. We know it can't be taken away. The disparity is such that what we're doing now is not working quick enough to close that disparity. So is something else needed? Yes, it is. Is it the voice? Most likely.
Okay. Far be it from an Irish guy. He was an Australian citizen to tell Australia what to do. But interestingly enough, in my little European country, we had a vote on an important constitutional item, and it affected the entirety of the EU, because if we had a veto, and the lack of clear information coming from the government, there was an assumption at the time that, well, we're a small European country, we're very, very pro-European, we get a huge amount of money out of what was, at the time Bonn, but it's Berlin now, and London and Paris, that we would just naturally, as sheep, just vote yes. But the lack of information from the government to be clear about what we were being asked to do in the Constitution gave an embarrassing no vote. And all of a sudden there was planes flying into Dublin Airport with ministers from the Netherlands and Germany. And anyway, in a typical Irish fashion, we went and voted again 6 weeks later. This time, in that 6-week period, the government on both sides had put together a very strong communication campaign. And I think for me as a communicator, it's a lesson that if there's going to be constitutional change, there has got to be strong communication, strong debate. And that's the only thing I would say. I don't mean I'm an Australian citizen, I'll be voting, but as an outsider looking in, knowing from my experience that when governments just take things for granted that it's, we're all good, something will happen. And that's the fear, I guess, is that unless somebody begins to crank up the chat and the yarn about the whole piece, then, and I know we're very early days, it's only right now, it's May the 26th, and we're talking about 5 months away, but there is that sense that we do need to crank it up. Do you not get that feel?
I do, and we can play into that, or we can simply ask ourselves, is the disparity good enough? Is what we have right now good enough? Do we want change? Do we want a higher level voice? Yes or no? It's as simple as that. We can crank up the communication. But let's just ask ourselves, what we have now, is that at the level where it needs to be? And do we want change?
Yep.
Yes or no?
I've attended a number of information sessions by a number of the politicians and crowds of up to 1,000 attending it, and going in there with an open mind, but listening to the arguments that can be presented. We're in a bit of a dichotomy here, because when they looked at why the Republic referendum failed last time, it was because they got into the details too early. And hence we have that problem now of saying we're not getting enough details, and yet for the previous Republican referendum, it was the details which killed the issue. Now, there is a lot of information out there. Right. If you look at the Marcia Langton, Tom Culmer report, 240 pages, right, addressed how the voice would be. And all this discussion we're talking about now with regional voices, that's all in that report, right? So, but the problem is not everyone's going to actually read that report. All right, so, but it is there and it clearly articulates that. But we do get this sniping from the side and they're basing that sniping on the lack of information. So perhaps, yes, there needs to be more, but let's encourage people, as we as a company have encouraged people, be informed, take the opportunity to go out and talk and listen, engage, have a yarn with Kim, have a yarn with me. We can only give you our opinions, right? But it's important that, I think a little bit more information will assist in overcoming that gap at the moment. But tremendous to see so many wonderful organisations, footballs and the unions and so forth coming together and saying, yep, we're with you on this particular one.
And as our own Stuart Reynolds says at Aspen Medical, he says to everybody in a meeting, be curious. Be curious, just question, be curious. So maybe at Aspen Medical, I'd say to everybody who's watching, be curious. Go out and find out what's going on. Last words, anything else to say? Get off your chest?
Not really.
Kick me under the table?
Not really. But I agree with that analogy, be curious. But I'd also ask you and everyone to deeply consider the impacts of intergenerational trauma, the impacts of having no voice in policies that impact us. Consider that and ask yourself, do we need more? Do we need better? Do we, as First Nation people, deserve better?
Kim, Steve, thanks so much. Loved it. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.